children do exist because I don't think Charlie would lie about having kids. Erika, on the other hand, as we've seen, lies like she breathes, like she has it down to an...
It happened faster than anyone expected. No warning. No build-up. Just a decision. And then, everything changed. Because according to online speculation, Erika Kirk walked into that courtroom expecting one outcome and left facing something completely different. Full custody, granted to the other side. And an order. $20,000. Immediate. Unavoidable. But here's where things get strange. Because the ruling itself wasn't the only shock. It was why it happened. Or more accurately, why some people believe it happened. Because within hours, fragments began surfacing. Alleged messages. Claims from anonymous insiders. References to details that were never part of the public story. And suddenly, this wasn't just a custody decision. It was something else. Something bigger. Because if even part of what's being said is true, then this case didn't just reveal a legal outcome. It exposed something that may have been hidden all along. So the question is, what did the court see that no one else did? Before the ruling, before the shock, before the numbers and headlines, there was a story no one was really paying attention to. Not at this level. Because at the center of it all was Erika Kirk. Not someone constantly in the spotlight. Not someone surrounded by constant media coverage. But someone connected to a narrative that had already been building quietly in the background. And like most stories that suddenly explode, this one didn't begin with a courtroom decision. It began much earlier. In fragments. Small mentions. Subtle references. Moments that didn't seem important at the time. But here's where things get strange. Because according to online speculation, the early signs were there. Just not obvious. People now point back to past appearances. Comments. Interactions. Situations that, on the surface, felt normal. Until they didn't. Because when you look at them after the outcome, they feel different. Like clues. Like pieces of something that hadn't fully formed yet. Meanwhile, the legal situation itself wasn't widely discussed. Not publicly. No constant updates. No detailed breakdowns. Just quiet progress. Behind the scenes. And that's where the tension builds. Because when something important is happening, but not being talked about, it creates a gap. And gaps get filled by speculation, by assumptions, by people trying to understand what they can't fully see. And that's exactly what happened. Because as the case moved forward, conversations started forming. Not official. Not confirmed. But persistent. Questions about custody. Questions about financial elements. Questions about what might be influencing the outcome. And then, small details began to surface. Allegedly. A mention of documentation. References to proceedings that weren't publicly explained. Nothing concrete. But enough to suggest there was more happening than people realized. And that's when everything started to shift. Because once people believe something is happening behind the scenes, they start looking harder. And when they look harder, they find patterns. Or at least, what feel like patterns. And that's what made this case different. Because it wasn't just about what was visible. It was about what wasn't. And then, the court date. No build-up. No major media attention. Just a moment that, at the time, seemed like it would pass quietly. But it didn't. Because what happened in that courtroom didn't just resolve a case. It changed the entire narrative. But here's the real question. Was this outcome expected? Or was it the result of something no one fully understood? Because once you start looking at the pieces, you realize something unsettling. This story didn't start in the courtroom. It started long before. And the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to separate what's real from what just feels real. The moment the ruling became public, everything exploded. Not because people understood it, but because they didn't. Because when a court grants full custody and attaches a financial order like that, people assume one thing: there must be something more. And that's exactly where the first layer begins. Because within hours, claims started appearing. Not official, not verified, but detailed enough to feel real. An anonymous post surfaced first, buried in a thread, then suddenly everywhere. The user claimed to have seen documents connected to the case. No proof, no uploads, just descriptions. But those descriptions, specific, references to evaluations, mentions of testimony, hints at concerns that were allegedly raised behind closed doors. And then they wrote something that changed everything. It wasn't just about custody. It was about stability. That was the moment everything shifted. Because now, the ruling wasn't being seen as procedural. It was being interpreted as reactive. A response to something serious. But here's where things get strange. Because no one could confirm any of it. There were no official statements detailing the reasoning. No public documents explaining the decision in full. Just silence. And in that silence, speculation grows. Fast. Then, the screenshots appeared. Again. Unverified. Blurry. Allegedly showing fragments of what looked like internal communication. No names. No headers. Just lines. The recommendation was stronger than expected. They didn't anticipate this outcome. It changed after the last review. Changed. That word spreads quickly. Because if something changed, then there was a turning point. A moment where everything shifted. And that raises a critical question. What happened right before the decision? Because according to some online speculation, there was a late-stage development. Something introduced close to the final ruling. Not publicly discussed, but significant enough to influence the outcome. And that's when the voice notes surface. Again. Distorted. Unconfirmed. But widely circulated before disappearing. In one, a voice allegedly says, "It wasn't the initial case. It was what came up later." That line hits differently. Because it suggests something new. Something not part of the original narrative. Something that emerged. And that's when the timeline becomes unstable. Because now, people aren't just looking at the case itself. They are looking at when things changed. And that's where the tension builds. Because if the outcome was influenced late, then the earlier understanding of the case was incomplete. Meanwhile, more users begin posting. Some claiming insider knowledge. Others just connecting dots. One writes, "Go back to the weeks before the ruling. Something shifted." Another, "Look at the silence. That's where the answers are." And then, the financial order. $20,000. People start focusing on it. Not just as a number, but as a signal. Because financial orders like that don't just appear without reason. At least, that's what some believe. Which leads to another layer of speculation. Was it tied to legal fees? A penalty? Something else entirely? No confirmation. Just theories. And that's what makes it powerful. Because once people start assigning meaning, they reinforce the narrative. And then, the role of perception changes. Because now, this isn't just about a court decision. It's about what that decision represents. To some, it's proof that something serious was uncovered. To others, it's a standard outcome being misinterpreted. And both sides sound convincing, which creates instability. Because when two opposing interpretations both feel plausible, certainty disappears. And that's exactly what happens. Because now, every detail is being analyzed. Not just for what it shows, but for what it might be hiding. And that's where the first real tension locks in. Because the more people dig, the less they agree. And the less they agree, the more the story grows. Because disagreement fuels attention. And attention fuels speculation. And speculation turns fragments into narratives. And right now, that narrative is still forming, still evolving, still unstable. Because what comes next doesn't clarify anything. It complicates everything. At this point, you'd expect clarity. A statement. A breakdown. Something official to anchor the story. But instead, everything becomes more complicated. Because the deeper people dig into the ruling, the less it aligns with a single explanation. And that's when the contradictions begin to surface. It starts with the timeline. Again. But this time, more precise. People begin mapping out the weeks leading up to the decision. Court appearances. Legal filings. Moments where the case quietly moved forward. And according to some online interpretations, there's a shift. Not obvious, but noticeable. A point where the tone changes. Where the expectations, at least publicly, no longer match the outcome. And that raises a disturbing question. Was something introduced late? That changed everything. But here's where things get strange. Because just as people begin focusing on that possibility, another piece appears. A longer, more detailed summary. Unverified, but written in a way that feels structured. Almost like a report. It outlines what it claims were concerns raised during the case. Mentions of evaluations. References to behavior. Suggestions of issues that were allegedly discussed privately. No proof. No official source. But detailed enough to feel convincing. And that's what makes it powerful. Because detail creates credibility. Even when it isn't confirmed. And then, a contradiction. Another user claims the opposite. That the case was straightforward. That the outcome, while surprising to some, followed a logical path. No hidden factors. No late developments. Just a decision based on standard considerations. And now, there are two completely different narratives. One suggesting something major shifted behind the scenes. The other insisting nothing unusual happened at all. And both sound plausible. Which creates instability. Because when two opposing explanations both feel real, certainty disappears. Meanwhile, the focus returns to Erika Kirk. Not through direct statements, but through interpretation. People analyzing past moments. Old clips. Comments. Behavior that, at the time, meant nothing, now being viewed differently. And that's when the emotional intensity increases. Because once people start analyzing behavior, they start assigning meaning, patterns, intentions, motives, even when none are confirmed. And that's where things become volatile. Because now, the story isn't just about what happened. It's about what people believe happened. And belief is powerful. But here's where it escalates even further. Because a new claim begins to circulate. Unverified, but repeated enough to gain attention. It suggests that additional documentation exists. Not public, not yet revealed, but potentially significant. And that changes everything. Because now, this isn't just about what's been seen. It's about what might still come out. And that creates tension. Because unresolved information creates anticipation. And anticipation builds pressure. Meanwhile, the role of silence becomes more noticeable. No detailed explanation from official sources. No clear breakdown of the reasoning behind the ruling. Just fragments. And gaps. And those gaps, they get filled with theories, with assumptions, with narratives that may or may not reflect reality. And that's what makes this stage so unstable. Because now, everything feels incomplete. Every explanation has holes. Every theory has weaknesses. And none can fully account for all the details. Which leads to a breaking point. Because when too many contradictions exist, something has to give. And what gives is certainty. Because at this stage, no one knows for sure what influenced the outcome. Only what it looks like from the outside. And that difference is everything. Because perception can shape a story just as much as facts. And right now, perception is driving everything. But what comes next doesn't just challenge perception. It redefines it. By now, it feels like the story is about the ruling, the custody, $20,000, the alleged documents. But what if that's not the real story? What if the ruling is just the surface? Because a new perspective begins to emerge. Quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. Not from insiders, not from leaks, but from analysts who study how information spreads after high-stakes decisions. And according to their breakdown, the most important shift didn't happen in the courtroom. It happened after. When people started interpreting the outcome. Let that sink in. Because it changes everything. According to this view, the ruling itself may have been standard. Complex, yes. Significant, yes. But not necessarily unusual. What made it feel extraordinary was the reaction. The way fragments were connected. The way incomplete details were expanded. The way uncertainty turned into narrative. But here's where things get strange. Because when people went back, not to the reactions, but to the limited confirmed information, something felt different. Less dramatic. Less definitive. More incomplete. Which raises a critical question. Were people reacting to what actually happened? Or to what it felt like it meant? Because feeling matters. It drives engagement. It spreads faster than facts. And once a narrative starts building around a feeling, it becomes powerful. Meanwhile, Erika Kirk remains at the center. But not through direct statements. Through interpretation. Through how people frame what happened to her. Some see it as a sudden collapse. others as a legal outcome being misunderstood. And both perspectives feel convincing, which creates something rare. A narrative without a stable center. And that's the twist. Because now, the story isn't just about the case. It's about how the case is being understood. Because understanding isn't fixed. It evolves. Through clips. Through discussions. Through repeated interpretations that build on each other. Until the original event becomes something else entirely. But here's the unsettling part. Because this doesn't mean nothing happened. The ruling is real. The impact is real. But the meaning? That's where things become unstable. Because meaning is shaped by context, by perspective, by the way information is presented. And once you realize that, everything changes. Because now, every claim feels uncertain. Every leak feels incomplete. Every conclusion feels temporary. And that's what makes this moment so volatile. Because you're no longer asking, what happened? You're asking, what am I actually seeing? And those are two very different questions. Because one seeks facts. The other questions perception. And once perception becomes the focus, the story begins to collapse. Not because it's false, but because it's no longer clear. And that's the twist. Not a hidden detail, but a hidden process. The way narratives form around incomplete information. And once that process becomes visible, nothing feels certain anymore. Which leads to the final stage, where everything breaks down. Once that realization took hold, everything unraveled. Not the ruling itself, but the certainty around it. Because when people stopped asking what happened, and started questioning how it was being interpreted, the narrative fractured into pieces. Some pulled back immediately, calling the entire situation exaggerated. A complex legal decision turned into a viral mystery. Others doubled down, insisting that even if the reaction was amplified, it had to be rooted in something real, something that justified the outcome. And then there were those in the middle, the most unsettled. Because now, nothing felt stable. Not the claims, not the leaks, not even the assumptions people had built around the case. And that's where chaos begins. But here's where things get strange. Because as the conversation intensified, the information itself started shifting. Again, clips that were circulating widely, suddenly harder to find. Threads discussing the case, locked or buried. New versions of the same evidence appeared, edited differently. Different tone, different emphasis. Almost like the same story was being told in multiple ways at the same time. And that only made things worse. Because when information isn't consistent, people don't assume randomness. They assume intent, even when none is confirmed. Meanwhile, Erika Kirk remains silent. No detailed explanation. No clarification of what happened in that courtroom. And that silence, it becomes part of the story. Because in moments like this, silence isn't neutral. It's interpreted. Some see it as strength. Others see it as avoidance. But no one knows for sure. And that's the problem. Because when interpretation replaces evidence, everything becomes subjective. Then, the evidence itself, those screenshots, those voice notes, those fragments that sparked everything, people begin questioning them more aggressively. Where did they come from? Why were they incomplete? Why did they spread so quickly and then disappear? And for the first time, the focus shifts away from what they suggest to whether they should be trusted at all. And that's when the collapse becomes complete. Because once trust breaks, everything else follows. The theories, the connections, the conclusions, all of it becomes unstable. And what remains is uncertainty. Not chaotic, structured, persistent, unresolved. Because now, there isn't one story. There are many. All incomplete. All competing. All impossible to fully confirm. And that's where we are. Not at an ending, but at a standstill. A moment where the narrative no longer moves forward clearly. It just exists. Fragmented. Still evolving. And that leads to one final question. If everything has collapsed into uncertainty, then what are we actually left with? So what are we actually looking at? A shocking court decision? A misunderstood legal process? Or something far more unsettling? A story that changed the moment people tried to explain it. Because when you step back, nothing here feels complete anymore. Erika Kirk, at the center of the ruling, yet silent. The court's decision, real, but not fully understood publicly. And everything surrounding it, built from fragments, interpretations, and reactions. And that's the unsettling part. Because every version of this story feels possible. Was the outcome influenced by something significant behind the scenes? Or did a complex legal process get turned into something dramatic through speculation? Were the clues meaningful? Or simply pieces of incomplete information connected too quickly? And most importantly, how much of what you believe about this case comes from what actually happened? And how much comes from everything that followed? Because once a narrative starts moving, it doesn't stay the same. It evolves. Through clips, through comments, through repeated interpretations layered on top of each other, until the original event becomes something else entirely. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the most powerful stories aren't the ones that give you answers. They are the ones that leave you questioning everything. So now it's your turn. Go back. Look at the details again. Not just what's visible, but what might be missing. Because whatever really happened in that courtroom, it didn't end there. It's still unfolding. Quietly. And the next piece might already be out there, waiting for you to notice.